Alrighty guys, let's get to it. So if you'll notice, we have two standards down there on the bottom, and you have seen these standards before. In this video, we are simply going to go a little bit more in depth. Let me rephrase that. We're going to go a lot more in depth, and we are going to see how they are related. So here are our LEQs. What is the law of diminishing returns? Keep in mind, you have seen this in Unit 2 when we were talking about the law of supply. Only I'm going to go more in depth in it in this video. And finally, what is marginal cost analysis and how do firms use this information? So here we go. We are starting with our first LEQ. What is the law of diminishing returns? Sometimes referred to as principal diminishing marginal productivity. We're going to call it the law of diminishing returns. So here is the textbook definition, as you will. And in all honesty, I'm going to read it to you, and it's probably not going to make any sense. When I give you an example, then you'll be like, oh, I get it. It's best explained through an example, but here we go. Law of diminishing returns is an economic law stating that if one input, remember guys, input are your factors of production, the price of inputs, land, labor, and capital. And labor is bolded there. I'll tell you why here in a second. So it's stating that if the one input in the production process of a good or service is increased, say if you acquire more land or acquire more labor or acquire more capital, while the other inputs are held fixed, that is, stayed the same, a point will eventually be reached at which additions of the input will result in progressively smaller, aka diminishing, increases in output. So that was a mouthful and it probably makes no sense. Allow me to explain through an example. Let's look at Jarrett's juice bar. So in my juice bar, I'm going to have someone manning the cash register. I will have 2 or 3 people actually working the juicers. I will have someone out on the floor cleaning, and I will have someone in the back prepping the vegetables to be juiced, something along those lines. So if I were to have one worker there, so class, one worker, which input am I talking about? I am talking about laborers. The most common example of law of diminishing returns has to do with hiring too many or too few laborers. You can talk about land or capital, but the most common example has to deal with laborers when it comes to law of diminishing returns. So if I have one laborer, you can imagine that one laborer is not going to be very productive. They have to prep the veggies, they have to juice the veggies, they have to man the cash register, and they have to clean up. That's, too much. 2 laborers, maybe one person in the cash register and one person juicing, and then the other they can divide the other task, versus 3 laborers versus 4 versus 5, and etc. And the question is, how many laborers should I have working at any given time to maximize my output? Once again, it's about maximizing output. There has to be a point where I hire enough people where they are working so productively, so efficiently. If I were to hire one more worker, they will begin tripping over each other. People will begin standing around because they literally, not that they're bad workers, they don't have anything to do. So that's this idea of law of diminishing returns. So imagine Jarrett's Juice Bar, a little old juice shop in downtown Lakeland, not too big. And if I have 15 workers back there, chances are they are going to be running over each other. People are going to be standing on their hands in their pockets because there's not enough to do. So as I increase my labor, what I was neglecting was I should have been increasing everything else as well. I needed to acquire more land, more vegetables to juice. I should have acquired more capital. I might need a bigger building, more cash registers, more juicers, more tables to keep those workers busy. So as my inputs rose, specifically my labor rose, I didn't increase my land and capital as well. That resulted in inefficient production. Now, law of diminishing returns leads us into this idea of marginal cost. So it's hard to talk about law of diminishing returns without talking about marginal cost. So here's what marginal cost is. It's the cost added by producing one extra item of a product. Now, once again, we are talking about expenses to the firm or business, not revenue or profit. So we'll continue with the Jarrett's Juice Bar example. Here we go. Considering all inputs, land, labor, and capital, it cost me $3 to produce 1 organic beet juice. So that's including paying my laborers, paying my rent, buying the beets themselves, so on and so forth. All right, if I produce 1 organic beet juice, it costs me $3. If I produce 2, it costs me $3, so on and so forth. Now, because of the law of diminishing returns, which I just spoke about, I will reach a point. It might be at 15 units of beet juice. It might be at 500 units of beet juice. It might be at 28 units of beet juice. But I will reach a point where it actually begins to get more expensive for me to produce it because I haven't increased my inputs. I might need to hire more laborers, or I might need to acquire more land, or get a bigger building, or high quality juicers, or a bigger refrigerator, or something like that. Marginal cost is basically trying to tell us at which rate of production should we work. So let's take a look at a graphing example. All right, so here we go. This is a marginal cost graph. If you'll notice, cost is on my y-axis. Now this is how much it cost me. I'm not talking about price here. This is how much it cost me to produce organic beet juice. And this is the quantity of units produced, aka how many units of beet juice. So here's what a marginal cost graph looks like. It kind of looks a lot like a Nike swoosh. So, whoop. That is a marginal cost graph. That's what it looks like. So I want you guys to think about this. At which point on this graph is it cheapest for me to produce my product? Once again, at which point on this graph is it cheapest for me to produce my product? Well, if the cost is right here, the cheapest point is right here, right at around 10 units. Now, do not confuse this with the demand or supply curve. That is not what we're talking about. So if I were a businessman analyzing this, it is cheapest for me to produce 10 units, whether it's per hour, per day. We're not concerned about that in this class, but it is cheapest for me to produce 10 units. So when it comes to using this information in the real world, business people use this to determine whether or not they should change or vary their rate of production. So me looking at this, I can say, okay, it's cheapest for me to produce at 10 units. It's going to cost me about $5 to do so. So remember, a marginal cost graph looks like a Nike swoosh, and it is used to determine how many units of a good or service one should produce. Okay, so now we're going to look at how marginal cost works in the different market structures. In a perfectly competitive market, the marginal cost is the same for everything. Again, a tomato is a tomato is a tomato. It costs one tomato farmer the same to produce one tomato as it does another tomato farmer to produce one tomato, as it does another tomato farmer to produce one tomato. When it comes to where the biggest difference is, it has to come in at monopolistically competitive markets, because monopolistically competitive markets do not always price their product appropriately. And here's why. Think about all the product differentiation, non-price competition, advertising that goes on in a monopolistically competitive market. Because of all of that, they are not as efficient at determining their marginal cost compared to a perfectly competitive firm. Now, on that same note, let's talk about wages in a perfectly competitive market. So quickly recall the characteristics of a perfect competitive market. There are many firms. There is easy access to information. They are producing the same or similar product, and I'm going to add to that in this video. That also means the same working conditions, same skills required, same levels of human capital. Here's how marginal cost, also referred to as marginal product, works for wage determination in a perfectly competitive market. Remember, in a perfectly competitive market, a tomato is a tomato is a tomato. It costs the one farmer the same as it does the other. Because of that, the workers should get paid the same as well. Now, a fancy way to put that in economic lingo, the value of the marginal product of the last worker hired will be the same for a new hire. That is, if the last worker was paid $10 an hour, the new worker should also be paid $10 an hour, aka the marginal product. Okay, we are now at our LEQ and review, so I'm going to try to tie this all together for you. So we start with law of diminishing returns, which basically says you can't increase one output without increasing the others. In the event you do increase one output without increasing the others, you're eventually going to hit a point, whether it's at 20 units or 2,000 units, where it starts to get counterproductive. And once the law of diminishing returns kicks in, that's when marginal cost kicks in. So a marginal cost analysis is used to help firms determine the rate of production. I want to say that again. Marginal cost analysis is used to help firms determine the rate of production. Think of that Nike swoosh graph we just did. So one specific thing you need to know, in a monopolistically competitive market, because they are not as efficient, they are worse at determining the appropriate marginal cost. Think about all the restaurants that go out of business. Restaurants of all business structures in a monopolistically competitive market, restaurants are the most likely to go out of business. The reason why, they have a hard time, whether they lack the professional skills, the accounting skills, the finance skills, they have a hard time determining their marginal cost. Also remember, in a perfectly competitive market, workers should all be paid the same as the prior employee. Thanks for watching this video. We will be discussing this more in class tomorrow.